an assistant professor in the Department of City and Regional Planning here at Cornell. I think the wonderful thing about arriving at the end of the semester is that we have all survived to this point, and that feels like a real triumph in this year and this semester when everything has been online. Before we go any further, could I have a volunteer? Oh, sorry, I always forget to show this. Can I have a volunteer who will give the land recognition today?
I can do it, Linda, if you want.
All right, go ahead, Nima.
So Cornell University is located on the traditional homelands of the Gayahono, the Cayuga Nation. The Gayahono are members of the Haudenosaunee Confederacy, an alliance of 6 sovereign nations with a historic and contemporary presence on this land. The Confederacy precedes the establishment of Cornell University, New York State, and the United States of America. We acknowledge the painful history of Gayahono dispossession and honor the ongoing connection of Gayahono people, past and present, to these lands and these waters.
Thank you so much. It's my great pleasure today to welcome our own Professor Nima Kudva to give the colloquium talk for today. Let me introduce her and then hand the talk over. And I also want to thank the department and thank Albiano Stinson and Chris Hinman for helping organize this talk. Professor Nima Kudva's research focuses on small cities and their regions and on institutional structures for equitable planning and development. She has explored various aspects of these issues primarily in South Asia, but also in the US and across the world with students. She is involved in pedagogical experiments around citizenship and sustainability planning and is faculty lead for the Nilgiris Field Learning Center in Kotagiri, a transdisciplinary engaged collaboration between Cornell and the Keystone Foundation. Nima is Associate Dean of the Faculty and House Professor and Dean at Becker House, a living learning residential community. She serves as faculty affiliate of the South Asia program, is a fellow of the Atkinson Center for Sustainable Futures, and as a field member for Public Affairs, Global Development, South Asian Studies, and Visual Studies. Prior to joining Cornell in 2001, Nima worked as a consultant to public planning agencies in the San Francisco Bay Area and as an architect in India and Europe. She received her diploma in architecture from the School of Architecture, CEPT at Ahmedabad, India, her MArch and MCP and PhD from the University of California, Berkeley. Please join me in welcoming Professor Nima Kudva. Nima, are you ready to go? You're on mute.
Sorry, I've been talking away and not realizing that this is classic. Can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, great. Why is it not lighting up?
We see your whole desktop. Is that what you're
Oh, so that's
wanting us
what's
to
going
see?
on. Sorry about that. I need you just to see my PowerPoint. And you see my PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay, great. So thank you, Linda, for that long introduction. Um, I was just thinking the other day that this is the first time I'm talking in the department about my work in all the years that I've been here. So this is welcome and interesting. So there's going to be 4 of us today. Lekia Mukavili, Reva Fansalkar, and Anna Schatz. And the 4 of us are going to be talking about a project that we've been collaborating on and working together on since about May this year. And so, they're going to, so Reva, Alekia, and Anna will present first on various aspects on the challenges and mishaps of this ongoing experimental work. And I'll bring in another collaborative project, the NFLC, the Nilgiris Field Learning Center project that Linda briefly mentioned, after that, and sort of end with connecting all of this to planning. So, this whole question of why this project, why did we do this? So, the pandemic is clearly challenging all of us, some more than others in various ways. And there are so many words that one can use to talk about it that I've decided today to just read from a poem that the poet sort of Christine Stewart Nunez wrote recently. And I'm quoting here, she says, "It's left us all unmoored. We click on graphs, charts, photos, testimonies of the sick, the dead, and the survivors. Shape and story our fears. Metaphor falters when we scrutinize the data, and we can't find beauty there." So this was so much on my mind as when we began to sort of articulate what this project, this particular project, and to frame it in the ways in which we wanted to do it. And so my instinct in these moments, is always to go out and act. But of course, the pandemic forced us to, I think, move away from action and to be a witness to what was happening, to all this despair and fear and solidarity that we were seeing in the world around us. And so this project really, from my part of it, begins in these impulses and in the twin impulse, really, about withdrawing into oneself towards solitude and silence, as Pamuk says in this quote, and at other times to be humble and to practice solidarity. So with that, I'm going to turn this over to Alekhya, I think, is the first one to be going.
Thanks, Nima. So before we present on our project, we just wanted to give some insight on why we joined the project, especially because at this point, it's all become something that's quite near and dear to us. So I joined the project in May. And at the time Nima mentioned the project to me, I was trying to understand what the playbook was for supporting people, how communities respond to systemic shocks. And I joined this call with a bunch of organizers from Bangalore, and everyone knew what to do. They were trying to organize food distribution to informal settlements, and they understood what had to happen. And I wanted to expand on this knowledge. And when I was approached with the opportunity to, I thought it would be a good way to answer that. Anna to introduce herself.
Yeah, hi everyone. So my name is Anna, and I'm an information science MPS student about to graduate. And so I was brought onto this project as the technical web developer. And I was approached actually by a professor in information science who Nima reached out to, and I'll talk about it a little bit later as well. But what really kept me on the project after that was this challenge of creating a space where these stories of solidarity can be shared, and kind of the intricacies of how we were going about that, and overall just the challenge of like going over the blocks and everything that we'll talk about later really is what kept me going with this project. And Rewa.
Hi, I'm Reva. I'm a second year MRP student, and my role in this project was a little bit of everything, which I'll talk about later. So Nima spoke to me about being on the project early this year, and on the same day, I had seen a post on social media about a rickshaw driver. A rickshaw is a very common mode of public transport in India. And he was using his vehicle to bring daily supplies to people in lockdown and raise awareness about COVID. And I remember thinking to myself that these are the stories that we will not really ever know about. But so when Nima spoke to me literally the same day about this project, the motivation really resonated with me, and I thought that these were the sort of stories that I wanted to find. So moving back to Alekhya.
Yeah, so first, before we go into the nitty-gritty of the project, I wanted to talk about what our ideal project was, because the project has transformed from this ideal goal that we had. But the mission statement that you see on the slide right now has generally stayed true. So While the project has changed, our methodology of carrying it out has been altered, but in the core tenets of what we hope this project represents have not changed, as I said before. So the goal was to archive and interact with how communities, specifically marginalized communities in the global South and the global North, have supported one another during the pandemic. Ultimately, we wanted to build an interactive virtual platform for people to share experiences that students and participants in the project could discuss. I'll speak more about the website and the video in further slides, but I wanted to sit a little bit with the concept of solidarity that we've all been discussing, because the purpose of this project is to understand how support systems manifest in a unique way. Research-wise, the project can be expanded such that students and participants alike can begin to understand how informal support networks can be built outside of formal institutions. And this includes how neighbors help each other, how communities become self-sufficient, or how, different organizations that have been doing this work can really change the way they work to offer support. So Nima, if you could go to the next slide.
Oops. Okay. Wait, is that the next one?
Yep.
Yeah.
That's the next slide. So as far as platform content went, this is what changed the most significantly. Content-wise, we were hoping to receive 3 to 5 minute videos from people we reached out to, ideally filmed in their communities. And we'll discuss some of the challenges that we face with this a little later, but we wanted the content to be self-curated by the person submitting the video. And the image here is the guidelines that we provided to people. We thought that the curation process, knowing what to speak about, would be pretty straightforward. But, as Anna will talk about and Reva will talk about a little bit later, it wasn't as straightforward as it seemed to us at the time. Next slide, please. So the platform design, we were really bent on having this interactive map and where you would click on one of these points and you'd be able to see a video of someone talking and have a discussion feed. I would say out of everything that we wanted for this project, this is probably the thing that pretty much matched our vision. Anna did a great job despite a lot of administrative logistical hurdles that we've had with doing this. But as far as this goes, we're pretty excited with the way it looks. And with that, I'm going to pass the torch to Anna.
Yeah, so next slide. Yeah, so of course, there were a couple of things that did not work out as planned when we began working on the project. So first of all, people who we reached out to were involved with on-the-ground work and were very busy or affected by the pandemic. So understandably, we didn't initially receive many responses. We also used formal language, which might have been daunting or unappealing for people to commit to while so much was going on. We initially asked people to record themselves and speak for 3 to 5 minutes, which again, understandably was a difficult ask, as well because it would involve a lot more planning on the participants' end. On the technical side, of course, we also ran into hurdles, which is actually the point during which I was onboarded onto the project. So Nima, like I mentioned earlier, reached out to a couple of information science professors, which is how I found out about this opportunity to build a website for what I thought was a super powerful way to reflect and learn about this time and how people are dealing with it. So which brings us to what didn't work on the technical side. First of all, we were taken on many different routes after talking to different departments at Cornell about how to go about and where to build this website. We ran into quite a few administrative blocks to build a site from scratch, which led us to explore a couple of other different platforms such as Campus Press, as well as Esri, which didn't really fit our needs in terms of the design of the site. We also looked into Wix and Squarespace, and again, these formats were also not exactly what we wanted and were not easy to make ADA certified. And now I'm going to pass it on to Reva to explain how we reframed our approach to our solution.
Next slide, please, Nima. Okay, so how did we change our approach and what are the next steps? Once we realized that getting responses was harder than we expected it to be, we were forced to re-examine our process. Nima, next slide. Like Anna mentioned earlier, the fact that we were asking people to self-record seemed to have become a barrier. We also decided that we would let people take their time and not hound them with reminders since we knew that they had bigger things on their plates. When we realized it was hard to get self-recorded responses, we switched to a very different approach almost organically, which was that of an interview or asking people to talk to us one-on-one. We also changed the way in which we were getting in touch with people. Earlier, we were sending out these formal emails, which probably made responding seem like a daunting task. So now we switched to more comfortable personal media like Instagram and WhatsApp and just asked for a conversation. The interview format proved to be much more successful, probably because it was now our job to structure and guide the conversation. So participants didn't have to script their responses anymore. We also had more control over when the interviews happened. We would set a time, give the interviewee an idea of what to expect, and record the conversation. Some people would show us the community that they were working in during the interview. Some others sent images later, which we plan to combine with the audio. Another thing we did is that we also more actively leveraged personal networks. And we realized that so many people that we knew, regular people who we've lived and worked with in the past, were either personally doing the work of extending solidarity to the community or closely knew someone who was. So pictured on the left is Chavi Khandelwal, a old friend of mine and the head of Saturday art class. Her organization was engaged in conducting art classes for children from marginalized and impoverished communities in Mumbai. But once the pandemic hit, they switched gears to distribute food and relief packets to the children's families. They also organized support circles and created art-based mental health kits for children who now had to be at home because they couldn't go to school anymore in often very violent and distressing environments. On the right is Prasad Shetty, who is the founder of the School of Environment and Architecture in Mumbai, where I worked in the past. He explained how the school had accounted for the digital divide among students when learning shifted online and how new experiences related to COVID were being incorporated into teaching and studios. Participation, like Anna said, naturally also increased as the initial shock of the pandemic dissipated. And people settled into new routines and found more time to reflect and engage in these conversations. Nima, next slide. In terms of the administrative and technical aspects of the website, we realized after almost 2 months of trying that existing website building platforms could not really offer the customization we needed. And we decided to make the website from scratch using server space that AAP agreed to provide. We did, however, decide to use some components from existing platforms in the final iteration. Um, the map component was made from scratch and the video functionality as well, but the interactive discussion section is integrated using WordPress, which makes it much easier to start discussion threads around common themes in the videos and have website visitors easily comment and add to the discussion. Nima, next slide, please. In terms of the next steps, a lot still needs to be done. So far, we have mostly been speaking to a lot of a key step now is to use our learnings and the new format to increase engagement, build on existing personal networks, reach out to people, and have more actual community members participate. Figuring out translation and captioning, surprisingly, is a much harder task than we thought it would be. We've had many contributions in local languages that auto translator softwares cannot detect, and it's challenging to accurately represent that information and make videos accessible. We are also in the process of actually engaging with the materials that we've collected so far, not only in terms of correcting, editing, and uploading them, but also in terms of attempting to find patterns, commonalities, and ways to consolidate learnings and think about it by developing the format and method for the course that Nima will be teaching in the spring. So what, Nima, next slide. So, what did we discover and how do we understand solidarity now? And I'll go first, and then maybe Alekhya and Anna can add to that. So for me, the most surprising realization from this project was how many folks belonging to my network had decided to take action in some way to help their communities. And it was not just the government organizations and the NGOs, but regular people, students, neighbors were all leveraging the resources and institutions at their disposal to take some sort of action. Because COVID impacted everybody, I think everyone wanted to help in some way. We also don't usually get to do research in this format. Having a conversation doesn't seem like a stringent scientific methodology, but it reveals so much. And I learned a lot from constantly changing and updating our approach as the situation around us changed, allowing us to really take ownership of this. And those, I think, were the most significant parts for me. Alekhya, do you want to go next?
Sure, thanks. So I would, to add to what Reva said, I think one thing that I learned through this process is just how much, no one really understands what's happening to them right now. Processing what's happened in the past 6 months is, it's a pretty significant ordeal, which is why I think the interview process helped, because asking people questions kind of allowed them to reflect on what has happened, what they did, why it was effective, in a way that, just having to sit with the past 6 months in a self-curated video might have been more difficult to do that. And I also think that we were able to have, as Reva said, these kind of more informal conversations that were able to feel more intimate, because solidarity in itself is kind of this intimate topic. There is no firm understanding of why someone has a sense of civic duty to help another person. And this was, a great way of seeing the different facets of that.
Yeah, so kind of to build off of that, I had very similar learnings from this project. So the way that we restructured how we reached out to people made it a much more informal approach. And I think that this created a space that is somewhat more inviting. And I think it's very important to create a space where people feel comfortable sharing their experiences, and for it to not feel like another item on their agendas for the day, which we all know their agendas have been very hectic. And so that really helped me, and I've never been a part of a process like this before. And so it was definitely a very great opportunity.
Nima, you're
I
muted.
get to go now, I guess, right? So, the idea was for you to hear about the project, from in many different ways, and it's going to be my role in a way to both, sort of to reflect on what the project is doing. Sorry for all the dinging. I'm trying to stop it, but it's just not working. And so it's my role here to sort of reflect, I think, on what it means to collaborate and to think about how collaboration, this idea of collaboration, what brought, the work method that we were using, in a way, how it's linked to solidarity, right? And finally, I hope to end with the link to planning more broadly. And to do so, I'm going to first speak to this other project that I've been involved in for at least a decade now. So the Nilgiris Free Learning Center. And so that project too is a collaboration, and it's with the Indian NGO, the Keystone Foundation, as Linda mentioned early on. And it started really when one of the three co-founders came to Cornell for the one-year Humphreys program. And he came here with a mission and organized a group of faculty at Cornell to dream that he had to construct this center. So the project has evolved over the years. It brings together, a group of Cornell faculty. Now there are faculty in Hawaii and Syracuse and the London School of but I don't know what it's called now, tropical medicine. So it's, faculty from all these places, as well as students, undergraduates, graduate students from Cornell, any discipline, as well as young people from the communities, from the Adivasi communities in the Nilgiris. And so the project addresses community expressed needs around issues of sustainability primarily. And it brings, Keystone's sort of long ties in the region and their strengths with our research and pedagogical experience and expertise. So we work collaboratively, as I've mentioned multiple times, across sort of 7 binaries. And at root, this project is about collaboration, but I want to describe these 7 binaries we work across. We're transdisciplinary. We engage in sort of plural knowledges, right? Both the social scientific, and thinking about traditional ecological knowledge. Education, research, and practice are not separate realms. Our focus is regional, not in the urban or the rural. We see health of the body as intimately tied to that of the community and the land, and diversity is both cultural and biological, and the two are interconnected. So the question of time cycles and scales is important, and project cycles and temporal scale there are multiple sort of ones, right? You can't be running a decade-long project and not have that be happening. And so there are annual cycles of students who come and leave. There are, 4 different areas within which we work, and so the project cycles within each of these areas is varied, and I'll talk about one shortly. So I can tell you a lot more about this project and how it runs and how it's structured, but we can leave that to the Q&A period if you're interested. What I do want to do, though, is spend a little bit of time describing some of the work and the ways in which all these boundaries are blurred, so you begin to see what I'm talking about. And so let me just look at my notes here for a minute. And one of the things that I'm going to start with are these crossing boundaries exercises, or that's the name we've given to them. The students call them CBEs. And so in the first 7 weeks of the spring semester, our students, and this cohort that is, it's a bilingual program, it's in Tamil and English. And so the students, the Adivasi students and our Cornell students, right, equal numbers, or more Adivasi, but never more Cornell. So they live and study together in Kotagiri for the first 7 weeks, and they're building their knowledge, right? They've started to learn both languages, but they're building their knowledge of each other's language, of concepts, of methods that they're going to be using, but primarily they're building their knowledge of each other, right? So they can work collaboratively in the field for the second half of the semester. So these CBEs are super structured. They run about 3 times a week. It's the first thing you do in the morning when we meet. They run for about an hour and a half, sometimes 2 hours, and they do all the things that are happening on the slide. So it's language learning. It's emphasizing these knowledge plurality, learning by doing, and it's always linked to research method, weekly theme, concept, and so on and so forth. And so there are other pieces to it, which I can again talk about later if you're interested. But I think what's important to understand is that there are about 20 or 21 of these, and they start super simple. How do you just say hello, right? In a attentive way, and it can become it starts to get a little more complicated. How do we talk about the body? Do we know? So it can be as simple as knowing about the words, and as complicated as how is knowledge transmitted, right? The idea of the nursery rhyme. How do you really learn to name the parts of the body? And it gets more complicated, of course, as feminist theorizing has pointed out about the female body. And so it can become, as the semester progresses, we're doing much more, we're taking on much more complicated ideas, like this one, where we're talking about who keeps order, right? And who keeps order moves into the question of governance, right? And governance, of course, is all about planning. And so we have all these sorts of connections that we draw out and take on through the first 7 weeks of the semester. So what I want to do is talk CBEs extends out through the week in terms of the learning, and then finally into the research and the ways in which we engage with community. So this is a CBE that really focuses on measurement and on taking measure using the body. And so we start with both groups of students talking about how you think about measurement. And what we learn is that taking measure is culturally grounded, right? And in discussions around taking measure, of course, all kinds of other discussions begin to emerge, right? On material and cultural and spatial practices. We are able to introduce the concept of survey by looking at everybody's measure, right? And this particular measure is the Jan. And so you begin to kind of be able to show that there is a rationalization of certain measures attached to the human body that become the kind of measurement system, the rational measurement system we are all much more familiar with, right? And then it takes us also into questions of mapping, because mapping, of course, is the way we take measure of the world around us, right? And the mapping question is very important because, of course, mapping again is a culturally specific method, and we are working with indigenous communities. And so in the learning sections of that week, that same week, we are able to explore various forms of mapping methods from, indigenous Marshall Islands maps of wave patterns that allow you to steer from one island to another, to something as ubiquitous as Google Maps, right? We use the body to map the campus that we're all living on, allowing students to begin to also understand the campus, and we always work collaboratively in groups. The mapping sort of exercises continue as we go to, into our field trips. And what we focus on really is not just sort of collaboratively mapping the trips that we're doing, but also on collaborative recall of the trips and what each of us saw. We consider how other methods of collecting information for mapping, walking, traversing, storytelling become critical, sort of tools of learning about each other and about the communities with whom we work, right? And so these are all the ways in which a CBE that's as simple as saying, let's learn about taking measure, right? Thinking about taking measure using the body fans out into all these different pieces. So all of this, sort of takes us into longer research projects, right, that happen in the second half of the semester. And the one I am most involved, I'm going to talk a little bit more about the one I'm most involved in, and it's the Water and Waste Project. And it's built really on Keystone's sort of considerable strengths that they have in understanding and the hydrological systems of the Nilgiris, as well as in multiple smaller projects they've done over the years that are interested in ecological restoration, and particularly through the relationship of the forest and streams and wetlands. So, but waste is a very significant part of the problem, and they had no handle on it. And this is something that I've been working on for some years. And so we brought these two projects together and articulated a research strategy along with the communities we work with that followed the Kunur River, which is one of the important rivers in the region. And we started to investigate, and you see there that the project starts in 2015. You see a map that was made to share with the community how and where our sites are located, and every year we've been building out this project and to really begin to understand how things work related to water and waste access, right, and as well as production, how they work in Adivasi and non-Adivasi communities. And so our focus is to collect data in places that are often forgotten and ignored and fall off the map for governmental and non-governmental agencies typically. And then we're also very focused on giving back the work that we're doing to the community. And so, for us, making infrastructure visible that is often invisible or not understood is quite central. And so in the waste part, thinking through these questions of what is getting produced, where, who's producing it, is important. And then things like the recycling networks that are so critical, deeply also much wider than just, they go out into the plains from the Nilgiris. So connecting all those pieces becomes super important. And of course, the part that I just want to briefly mention is not central to this work, is the ways in which our Cornell students who are part of this project come back and then riff off this. So this particular one on waste, for example, became an honors thesis in the ILR school. So I started really by noting that the NFLC is at root about collaboration. And I want to talk about some, sort of aspects of it, right? And so it's fundamental to everything we do as a research method, as a way of working and engaging with each other. And so I've talked about how collaboration across disciplines to meet the sustainability and climate adaptation challenge is quite central to what we're trying to do. So, and the other part of it is we're teaching students the skills, right? The skills of sort of that underlie the ability to collaborate, the ability to engage with others different than themselves, and as we're learning to do so in the same way. And this sort of ability, learning these skills, which people often denigrate as soft skills, but which are so central to professional life, regardless of which discipline you really, or which area of work you're really going to be focusing on into the future. So this is one piece of it that I think is really important. So for me, being part of this project, it's been, the work has been so fundamental to thinking about collaboration as co-production. And this is very different from thinking about participatory planning, something that you hear about so much. So there is, at root, when I talk about collaboration, it's about co-production. And it's about a practice that is not extractive. And this is a huge challenge for anybody who works internationally, right? Outside the communities that we live in. The work very often becomes extractive in its nature, and I think education struggles with it in particular. And so what it allows me to do, this kind of work, is that it allows me to participate, to collaborate in the building of an institution, right? At the same time that I'm doing my work. And so it's become the modality actually of my scholarship everywhere at this point. So one of the most important things that I've learned, and I'm looking here for my notes again, is about friendship. That one of the strongest drivers here is really about friendship being the context of learning to live and work in the ways in which we've described, all of us, all four of us. And so I want actually to read out something here from David Scott's preface to this, the issue of the journal Small Acts. And this was a special issue that they did called Friendship as an Art of Living. And David writes there, "What I have been learning is that the idea of friendship is partly the idea of a form of solidarity and comradeship that, while shaped by a sensibility for non-judgmental and non-instrumental letting be, is nevertheless scarcely aimless. Friendship, I believe, is a dimension of reciprocal learning conducted with significant others, such that who one is in consequence of the paths taken and not taken is enriched and enlarged and sometimes even transformed. Friendship is neither sentimentalism nor abstraction, but a way of living assembled out of what is earned and what is inherited." So that's been on my mind a lot, trying to understand and interrogate this. And I see this in the lives of my students and in the ways in which the Nilgiris lives on in the work that they continue to do. So back now to where we started, the stories of solidarity, right? And I want to sort of, and I think what you've been hearing about, that they're not just stories of solidarity. You're looking at a project that has put in place solidarity amongst the four of us working on the project. So stories in solidarity is about stories, that are sort of promoting this notion of solidarity, of habitually sort of making it a habitual part of our practice. And so at the NFLC then, if we take back this idea about infrastructures of solidarity, and I get that I use that phrase from a wonderful article by Sarah Schillinger in a journal called Citizenship Studies, which Natalie helped me find. She's working on with me on some research, so thank you, Natalie. And so so what Sarah does in that piece is really talk about where the actions sort of register, and they have different registers and they work at different scales. And I think it describes the work in the Nilgiris project, and it describes how things are emerging in our Stories of Solidarity project very, very well, right? Where Schillinger talks about sort of the intimate friendship-based and care relationships that are at the core of this kind of work. She talks about multiple kinds of interventions, about activist projects that also begin to happen. She talks about strategic political partnerships with outside actors that are central to taking the work forward. All of this I can talk about and describe in the Nilgiris project. We can begin to see it in the Solidarity project. And in Schillinger's work, she's talking about a racial profiling project in Switzerland. We can also add this idea that Reva brought up of the formal and the informal, right? There are formal encounters, scripted encounters, and then there are all the informal pieces that allow this kind of work to happen. Another important piece that I think, the two projects that we've been presenting here today really bring up is that there are both sort of temporary acts, right? But they build on latent networks. And you heard about it in terms of the Saturday Club, the art club that again, that Reva noted in Alekia. We've got multiple interviews now that we're beginning to see these kinds of patterns in the Stories of Solidarity project. And so what is interesting to us is also the very particular forms of spatiality and the spatial practices that we are beginning to see embedded in these kinds of networks, hence the maps that we've been sort of really bringing to the work to really think about spatial practice at the same time. So there's a deeply entangled and contingent nature to this practice, right? To this to this practice of habitual solidarity, if one wants to call it that. And so I want to end by thinking briefly about what the relationship is to planning. Most of you here on this call are planners or aspire to be planners, and you must be rolling your eyes at this point and thinking, what's all this talk about friendship and solidarity? What the hell does it mean beyond COVID? And there's a wonderful recent piece, I think it's from last year, from in JAPA by Ward and Stacy, Ward Lyles and Stacy Swearingen-White. I can never say her name properly. And the piece is called Who Cares? And what they do in that piece, and it's based on a larger project that they have, what they do in that piece is talk about the emotional paradox in public engagement, right, for planners in particular. And they want to reimagine, they want to push us into reimagining planning as caring, as the act of paying attention, something that John Forrester talks about as well. So they describe, Ward and Stacy describe this work that we've been describing to you, this kind of work in various projects that they've been looking at. So they describe it as a story of how planning is framed as being skeptical of emotion and of seeking very rational, logical explanations, of providing advice, tools, skill sets, information, analysis, and that it in terms of how we teach planning, we tend to do that, and we remain away from the emotional work that planning sort of does require, and they take on those questions, and they take on the questions of why, in terms of our education, in terms of our practice, we neglect these interpersonal forms of knowledge and the various kind of relational skills that are fundamental to effective planning. And here again, I'm really talking about planning in, for, and with very diverse multiple publics. And so I'm keeping an eye on time here, and we've gone way over. So I'm going to stop, and I'm just going to say thank you for listening, and we'll take questions. Should I stop sharing?
We have that one question in the chat already, which comes from Mark Minton, and it is, in what unexpected positive ways has the pandemic impacted people who have participated in these conversations on solidarity?
I could go first, and then maybe you guys can add to that. So I think one way that is really striking to me is it has really, like, at least from my experience of the interviews I've done, it's brought the conversation about not a thing in India right now. It is leagues behind from how we talk about it in the US, especially in the communities that some of these organizations are working in. So, with what Saturday Art Class does, is they started with this sort of survival response of providing food packets, but then the actual problem was, like, because they were working with children, like for the children, the pandemic also impacted so many other things apart from like their access to resources, which is where they are really addressing that gap, where they have formed these support circles where children get to meet their peers in socially distant ways, and that's challenging in settlements that are very dense sometimes. So, and now children have the ability to articulate these things. They can talk about stress, they can talk about worry, they can talk about violence, which is not just physical violence. And I feel that that is leagues ahead of how we were discussing mental health before COVID. So I guess it's just equipped more people with being able to articulate how they are feeling in better ways. Apart from that, I think it also forced a lot of people to address the digital divide that already existed but was not this apparent before the pandemic hit. So a lot of educational institutes have really have to had to pull up their socks together and pool in money to get in laptops for people who didn't have it, to think about how to take juries online for people who didn't have money to print sheets before. And I know this from my experience of architecture schools, and because I spoke to people who are involved in the architecture practice. So, yeah, those are some ways that I can think of. Other collateral positive impacts that came from COVID. Alika, you can add to it if you want.
Um, this isn't, I don't think I had a lot of maybe positive takeaways from this. I mean, I think one thing is that that people are able to organize to form a safety net. That's an overall positive. But I think another positive that is indirectly more overarchingly a negative is that in India, COVID drew a lot of attention to the state of migrant workers in cities. And I spoke to this journalist at an organization called the People's Archive of Rural India. And she was involved at the city level food distribution organizing in Bangalore. And she mentioned this as well, where, you know, unfortunately, it took a shock, a systemic shock of this level to make people finally care about the status of migrant workers in India. But that is one of the positives, where now people are thinking about them and thinking about how their cities run, because there are all these informal workers who fuel, you know, probably unwell paid for labor.
Yeah. You know, anything, I find the language of positivity and negativity, again, sort of this binary, very difficult, because what has emerged in extremely challenging circumstances. And we, of course, are, you know, quite focused on trying to understand what happens in communities that are struggling, and so it's in the United States and in India, and in so far that's the two areas that we've really focused in on. And so I don't know, I find it difficult. What is amazing is the ways in which people have reached out. And so, yeah, I'll just end it at that. And I see there are lots of other questions in the chat. And so Natalie has a question where she says, you know, how do you have do you collect stories across cultural divides? And how do they remain authentic? And so I think the challenge for us, Natalie, when we thought about authenticity and collecting stories across divides, our thought was that by asking people to just produce their own story and put it up there would have been the way to go. We hadn't quite reckoned for how deep the reluctance would be to do that, or the difficulty. And the difficulty is maybe because of connectivity. It might be because of the existence of the digital divide and the discomfort with it. But we're also, we've talked about this quite a bit as we try to figure out what to do, and Alekhya and Anna and Reva will chime in if I miss anything out. But one of the things that I was so intrigued by was how things shifted when we began to do the interviews. And it was almost as if, and I think Reva's talked at some length during the presentation about why we think so. But there is also something very weird about sort of gatekeeping, right? And somehow us saying that it was going up on a website in this sort of northern university that has presence and some imagined power, was a big hurdle. So at one level you can look at it as a hurdle. At another level, you can really talk about it as it's so fascinating. People were quite careful about how they wanted to structure what they were saying. So again, not going into the positive negative side of it, but understanding that once we start to share openly a story, we seem to exercise self-judgment and how we want to present it in a different kind of way, rather than if I'm just holding up the phone to myself in a room by myself and saying what I want to say. So that kind of editorial sort of control that is being exercised the minute any relationality comes into play, for me, is quite fascinating, because it opens up all sorts of questions about how we work when we are confronted with the other, right? So that's one piece of it. And so authenticity there, I don't even know what that means in that context. I gave that example because I want to use that example to open up this question of what we even mean when we say authentic. So that's my response to Natalie's question. Alekhya, Reva, Anna, did you have anything to add?
I would just say that I think translation also remains a part of that piece,
Yes, huge.
because a lot of people have been talking to us in regional and local languages, and it's not always possible to, because the interviews are so rich in like nuanced meaning and sentiments, it's not possible to just directly translate it into English using closed captioning and things like that. So also we don't speak all the languages, so we've had to rely on other people. So Nidhi was very helpful in doing this, and so like
And
we are talking
Bhavna.
to our networks to sort of make sure that that bit is as
Yeah.
accurately done as possible.
We were very when we started this project, I had been talking a lot to the folks in IS, and there was all this sort of gung ho energy around, oh, there's machine learning this, and we can use AI for this and that and the other. It has bombed for us in some ways, and has been working on it. And the thing is, it's because of the languages we're using. And so this question of who you're working with and their positionality within the digital world, within the real world, that marginality that comes along with it is so striking, I can't tell you, right? So Google Translate just falls apart. And so on and on and on. And we can talk about this endlessly, having talked about it endlessly amongst ourselves as well. But that's been a really it's been a struggle, and continues to be a struggle. So John asks, wouldn't you say that I'm adding the all, John, participatory planning should be co-generative and collaborative, and that if it isn't, it's not really participatory? I've been thinking about this quite a bit, right? How is collaboration different from participation? And for me, it centers on that question of extraction in a way. So generative for me is a different word from ownership. And co-production for me has the potential for ownership. And I don't think participation, so I don't think you can do collaboration without participation, but I don't think participation necessarily needs collaboration, which is why it's so easily co-opted. I mean, the World Bank does not do a single project without participation now. The state of California, you cannot put a window on in your house without your neighbors agreeing and there being participatory components to creating housing plans and this plan and that plan. And so I do think there's a difference. I'm not, we're still, this is an experimental project. I mean, we're still in the experimental thinking through stages, and so we welcome comments and feedback. But I do think it's not the same thing, John. And we're still trying to figure out exactly how it would be different. Reva, Lekya, Anna. Oh, okay. So we'll just go on. What's the next one? I've lost track of the questions.
Natalie's next, but I think Anjali's question might actually follow quite organically from what you
Oh,
just said.
okay. Can you elaborate on the term?
So Anjali just asked, sorry.
Yeah, go ahead, Aleki, sorry.
Can you elaborate on the term extraction in relation to work, especially academia, extraction and the doing of work, pulling out findings, publishing, interpreting? Can you talk about how we can do work without risking being extractive?
Yeah, Nima can go first, and I have a little bit to add after that.
Why don't you start, Reva?
Okay. So, like one way that I think about this broadly is that um, is in terms of the power relations inherent in the process of doing research. So, where do you come from? What is your positionality, and who are you approaching, and how much of labor do they need to do to sort of provide information to you, and then whose capital ultimately increases. So if you find yourself doing work that is ultimately increasing your social capital while somebody else who is in a position of lower power to you doing the labor, I would guess that for me would be extractive, and I would try to find ways for that to not happen. In this case, it wasn't always like that um, because I was doing the interviews and talking to my personal networks, there was not that much of a gap between power relations. It was also very informal. We were not asking people to really we were not pushing people to participate. It was a very voluntary process. So, but we did think about this in the beginning in relation to this project, and maybe Nima can elaborate a little bit more on that.
We didn't think about what? What was the last bit, Reva?
About how to make sure that we are not being extractive.
Yeah. Um, so I think this particular project moved so fast. And while Anna joined us, without knowing the three of us, and we kind of just dragged her into it. Alekia, Reva, and I had worked together for at least a year, yeah, before that, and they'd worked on me with me. We'd worked together on various projects, my projects, which are not sort of always collaborative. I mean, both of them were like research assistants at one point, and so but we had established relationships with each other, and both of them sort of knew about the kind of other work that I was trying to do. So I don't think we were so explicit in the stories project about what we were trying to do, and yet it worked collaboratively. I mean, there were periods of time in which I was so checked out because I had so much work to do with the Cornell reopening, or with the all the diversity and equity work that we're trying to do in the college, across the university, that the load of the project was really just on Alekya's and Reva's and Anna's shoulders, and they were moving things forward and innovating. We would still keep meeting, but they were really taking this forwards. And so I say that because I think that is part of this, links back to this extraction piece, Anjali, in that, just so all of what Reva said is true. The core kind of ethical value is whose capital is increasing in whatever project that might come out of it, a storytelling project, a writing project. I mean, who's getting the benefit of it, right? I think that's always the core ethical principle. But then the other part of it, when you watch it at work, is that other piece, right? Did the project just die because I was preoccupied with other things, or because Reva had something else to do, or Anna could, had another intent? Or did it just keep moving forward because it became suddenly everybody's? at least for that short period of time. And so I do think that's a piece of it. Of course, there are real issues of constraints, whether it's administrative stuff and when I had to come in and flex my faculty muscle, or, or issues of money. We have to, of course, raise funds, right? Everyone needs to be paid on the project and so on and so forth. So there are real issues of resources and stuff. But I think the response to extraction would be that.
Yeah, I would also like to, add on and emphasize something that
Yeah.
Reva said, where, these conversations, while we prepared questions and sent them to the people that we were talking about, we did try to make them feel informal and feel comfortable. And that hopefully maybe led to a less extractive process. But, it's just not black and white. And that's something that, as we synthesize the information, that's something that'll have to come up again. The way that it's being transcribed, the way that it's being presented to people, that question will never be answered.
Yeah. Yeah. So, following up on that same question in terms of the thread, and forgive me if I'm missing questions here, Sonia is saying, so if your research leads to social and political action that betters the community, would it still be extractive? See, when we're talking, or when I'm talking about extraction, or Reva talked about it before me, I think it does go back to thinking about sort of where the locus of change sits, right? And I'm sure there are certain forms of change when infrastructure is put into a community, or the government brings healthcare, a mobile health clinic into a community. That is hugely helpful, and that sort of improves the life of the community. And of course, no one is going to say that that's extractive. But that kind of emerges at a different scale, in a different way in which we think about governance, and the different way in which we think about the role of the state. When we're talking about extractive, we're really thinking about the planner, the researcher, the educator, and our one-on-one role in that engagement. So, Sonia, I think I would respond by saying, the institutional work one does, the location of those institutions, and how we begin to work it, I think there will be issues of extractive knowledge and extractive work, but they'll get operationalized in somewhat different ways. That's how I would respond to that. My God, we have a lot of questions. And Lakia, are you keeping track of this?
I think we skipped Natalie's question. So Natalie asked, how does solidarity typically change in the moments of crisis? How is solidarity adapted to specific, more solitary crisis?
Anna, you start this time. Or not, if you don't want to. Whatever.
I just don't know. I wasn't really a part of the interviewing part.
Yeah, that is
So
true.
it's definitely a little harder for me
Anna's
to.
our
Anyone wants to ask any questions about the website?
tech part. Yep.
There are
She did
questions
an
about
enormous amount
visuals,
of work.
actually.
I
But
can talk about Natalie's question really quick based on what Prasad told me. So he said that for a lot of communities, solidarity was not not having solidarity was not
Was
an
not an
option
option. Exactly.
because of the solitary crisis. So, for example, in Dharavi, because social distancing was just not an option, there are shared toilets, there are houses that are squeezed against each other. A lot of communal spaces are common spaces where families eat together. So being around people is just a non-negotiable part of daily life. And that is why people had to mobilize really fast. This also means that there were already existing social networks that could quickly step in and take action. And Dharavi has become like one of the biggest success stories of um, collective action against COVID now. Like a lot of people are writing about it. It's been a success story. They also had to put aside their differences with the city administration. There are a lot of tensions there, but because of how this crisis was playing out, that was momentarily put aside, and BMC officials were working together with community leaders and community institutions to just quickly mobilize through this. So I guess that is one example that addresses Natalie's question.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I just want to say, Natalie, in response to your question and some of the other questions that we've been getting about whether there's a shift in crisis. Um, Everything that we're seeing in what we're hearing and what I've been watching in terms of the interviews is amplification. So it amplifies things. It doesn't. Sometimes differences are put aside, like the tension with the state, especially with the local police. That just sort of puts things aside. But in other cases, there's just it's everything just gets amplified. The tensions get amplified, and so I don't know about there being something categorically different. It's just that the scale of it changes. Wouldn't you agree?
I would add to this. So, with regards to Reva's response, that was kind of the reality of a global South city. We also spoke to someone Quinn, who's on the call, introduced us to, who has been doing a lot of work in her individual capacity as a private citizen for people in the Yakima Nation on the reservation in the areas around. And a lot of what she did was just, figuring out where people needed help and driving there herself. And so, with regards to how solidarity has adapted, I mean, I think, and I mentioned this before, just people's sense of civic duty points, I think that has really scaled for some people in a positive way.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah. I keep thinking of this word habitual, right? So maybe one way of thinking about the crisis was that, like for us and for all four of us, it forced us to sort of look outside ourselves and to connect out, to stop just being a witness, but to actually make that move into trying to think about actively being active witnesses in a way, right? So maybe there's something there about thinking about how one understands that piece of it, such that we can think about sort of planning in the service of a more equitable or just world outside of sort of within that realm of civic virtue in different ways. So there might be something there. I don't know. Something to think about.
All right, so can move to the next question if that's okay. Thene, and I'm sorry if I mispronounced your name, says, as a planner and an architect, I absolutely enjoyed the presentation, especially how Nima linked the whole theme with planning. I would like to thank the team. I'm just going to skip that part. My question will be, if you look to expand, collaborate with more local organizations from India or the Nilgiris.
Oh gosh, I wasn't even listening because reading Ryan's question. I'm so sorry, Alekia. That's
All
so
right,
bad. My attention was gone. You answer. You guys answer.
it's for you.
Oh shit. Now I didn't even listen. I'm so sorry. I was looking at Ryan's question and thinking, oh, now Anna's got a question on the
Oh, I
web.
guess the question is just my question is if you are looking to collaborate, expand with more local organizations from India, Nilgiris.
Oh, okay, okay, okay. So we have a bunch of interviews with folks in the Nilgiris because, like Reva said, and I don't know, maybe it was Alekia, maybe it was Anna, I can't remember. Said, when we shifted strategies, we connected to our personal networks, and so the folks that I work with in the Nilgiris, for example, are already on it. And one of the things that we thought about how to collect stories was the solidarity part, right? That it's somehow it Nidhi talks about it, I think, in one of the comments on chat, that the business of this co-production with the interview and the talking itself is something, I don't know, it's been important. I think it's been important for us as well. I watch Reva and Alekia do the interviews, and it's been important to them too, as much as it's important to the people they're talking with. And so I think so that was the impetus for thinking about the class for the spring, was to invite students, anyone who wants to join us, because of course it'll be online, so it can even be people from outside Cornell, but people to join us to create these stories, but to think through these questions of solidarity, to think through how to make the interview, how to do the interview, to do it ethically, thinking about all these questions that we've raised here today. So as it's a form of research, it's a form of engagement, it's a form of planning, it's a form of giving back. And so that's what we want to do. So I'm sort of expanding a little bit more than what you asked, but that's where that's where I'd sort of stop at the answer. Does that make sense? Okay. So Anna, big question for you from Ryan Thomas in the chat.
Yes.
Ryan, you can just ask them also, whatever.
Yeah, so I'll just read the question. Is the website up? For Anna, what will be the conceptual and technical challenges in terms of structuring this knowledge into a digital format? How do you think about structuring and interpreting the information you collected to be impactful for different audiences? Are there specific audiences for this? So the website is up, but the videos are still in progress. So I think we're planning on having some of them up in January. So stay tuned. In terms of the challenges that I see for this project going forward, at least in terms of kind of the structuring of it, will be, so we have videos, right? But then we were also thinking about adding tags. So these sort of like broad concepts or broad challenges that like apply to more than just one video. And so originally we were thinking of having the users come up with those tags, or the people who are actually speaking the videos to come up with those tags. But I'm wondering if it would be better to kind of, and again, this will be for someone after me, to have kind of the artificial intelligence aspect come in terms of coming up with these tags and groupings. And so that will definitely be interesting, because that will kind of structure who is joining a discussion. If they don't think that that discussion is really applied to them, then they wouldn't be joining that discussion. But I think the tags is definitely going to be the next challenge, both technical and conceptual. So unless it's on us or on the research team to come up with those tags, or whether it's going to be kind of more AI, the technical person doing this.
Yeah, so that's one part of it. Ryan, then the other part of it, which we've talked quite a bit about, but I think that's set up is, part of this was also about how people would comment or they would engage with the videos too, right? So there's that part of it. And does that happen through more organized sort of structures of classes? Because there are some faculty that I've been talking to, people I already work with and collaborate with, who've kind of expressed, an interest, but they're not sure how they would take it forward. So there's that part of it. There was one idea initially that's, when I talk to people I collaborate with, they were very interested in hearing other people's stories, and so would that be some kind of set of connections? But I think that's going to be super hard. It's great in imagination, not clear to me that that'll actually work out, but yeah, it might. We remain open to it. And then the other piece of it is that random person who visits the site and wants to comment, right? And how do we manage that? And how do we think about that? So I think those are all pieces we've talked about. The search functionality is tied both to the tagging and the metadata, but it's also tied to place and, all kinds of, so there is a whole metadata, AI, all of these pieces that we've been throwing around and thinking about. And Anna's been, of course, educating the three of us on how all of this works. I know more about this than I ever thought possible. And so then, but not that I could do a thing, I just know about it. And so that's a piece of it that I think is super important. But we keep coming back to this question of language. And how, find me somebody who will translate. Even Tamil, we can't get good translation. It's sort of interesting. You'd think, given how many million people in the world speak Tamil, Polish you can get it. There are way more people, many million people who speak Tamil, but you can't get it. And so it's a challenge that we're having a real struggle with. And it opens up so many questions in terms of thinking about large countries where work on basic form of communication, language, is just ignored. and then talk about the digital divide. So there's that. I don't know if
Anna,
that.
do you also quickly want to talk about the ADA compliance bit?
Oh
Because
God, yeah, my God, that's been a headache.
that's been another thing that to
Yeah,
figure out.
yeah, very
Yeah.
difficult.
Yeah, for sure. So kind of like what I was talking about in terms of the problems that we ran into, the ADA compliance piece is also more challenging, I would say, than other websites because of the video piece, and kind of making that, and that also ties in with translations. Also the ADA piece, which we were all learning as we were going on with this project, it is not just having translations, but for example, if you have a video on a website, the kind of background ADA compliance piece has to also narrate, this is a map, and on this map, there is a video, and
Yeah.
this video shows this, and it shows this, and this is what this person is saying. So it's a lot more complex than just kind of having a photo, for example, and like this is what the photo shows. So it like has all of these other pieces which we still haven't figured out. So yeah.
Yeah. So that simple little map with a click and an image has become something so much more complicated. And we're looking for another Anna if anybody wants to join us, because she will go out into the wide, wide world in December, at the end of December.
I think we missed Hannah's question in the middle, which
Oh,
says, have you considered including visual arts or photography in this project? I guess, Nima, you should answer that.
in what way?
So we have for the videos themselves and the way that the videos will be edited, but as far as the visual goes, the map is kind of like our routing visual for everything. Because you can also zoom in on it and see streets and kind of understand the location where people are being interviewed.
Hannah,
Yeah.
what were you thinking? You can talk to us about it. I don't think I understand the question.
I know of an organization that calls for photographs that are submitted by the individuals themselves that visually shows what they've been working on or the situation
Yeah.
where they are, and maybe including that on your map in some way or within your project.
We have that actually. So if people are giving us, you're saying on the map itself. Okay, that's interesting. So we do have, I think Reva, someone talked about it. So sometimes people have preferred just to do audio interviews. Nidhi's interviews were audio, no?
Yeah.
And so I think, so some interviews are just audio, and when interviews are just audio, we've asked people to send us images as well. So we do have that. So it's either a video or audio plus image. So yeah. Thank you though. So yeah, super aware of sort of both the visual and and the audio at the same time.
So I think Nidhi had a comment that was interesting and probably additive to what we were talking about in terms of extraction. That's the last thing I see here, but I think in an interview format, any knowledge or insight is co-produced, unlike a self-uploaded video recording. I think these are co-produced stories because when you interview someone, you know something about what to ask, probe them. Just a reflection on how to contextualize the editorialization of these stories and the role that language as culture plays, which I think is a really good point.
Mm-hmm.
Especially given how we were interviewing people.
Yeah. And it became something that we had to pay a great deal of attention to when the self submissions strategy did not quite work. And so it's become something quite central to what we're paying attention to.
Nima, can I ask a question?
Sure, Linda.
There's so much literature, including like the literature that Victoria has written on about the problematic nature of defining community and how community itself can be exclusionary in various ways. And some of the benefits of solidarity is also to pull solidarity across difference. So there's a kind of within group versus across group solidarity. And I'm wondering how the stories that you saw, to what extent it reflected intra versus cross group solidarity.
So I think it's our sample is not big. So it's a difficult question in that sense to answer, but just based on what we're seeing, I mean, we talked mostly, like Reva said, I think, we haven't talked to people who were in sort of at the receiving end of acts of solidarity or who were actually performing them. I don't know, none of that language sounds right, but we talked a lot to folks in organizations, NGOs, or other community organizations. Actually, that's not completely true. There are quite a few interviews with people who are actually doing the work, and so that's not true. So what I'm struck by is the reaching out part, right? So it's not remaining just within the communities that one is comfortable with. There is some of that because, like Prasad pointed out, and that we were hearing from the work that we do with other community, with sort of other groups, was that sometimes it's not solidarity as much as just forced survival requires you to do certain things. And so how do you separate out actions that are born out of solidarity, that is something sort of uplifting or something, compared to something that is just forced out of survival? You need to survive, you need to get that food, you just have to do this, and you do it, and you don't think about, like, is this person in my community, not in my community, and so on and so forth. So is there difference in the kinds of solidarities we're talking about? That's come up, I think, for any of us who watch all those videos that we have now. You'll start to think about that, right? Does it remain in community? Does it remain outside community? How do you define community? I've always thought that David Harvey's description of community as being a militant particularism is one of the most cogent definitions that I can hold on to, where just like our identities are intersectional, our communities are not static. And they depending on what I'm doing, when I'm doing it, with whom I'm doing it, I think many of us, the more sort of this sort of global lot, or the more privileged lot, but even those who are not, the notion of community cuts across many of these sorts of hard lines. There are parts of the world where the lines are very hard. I'm never going to say they're not. But I also think there is that aspect of community, this militant particularism, that is really important to consider. So I would actually say at one level that what we're hearing about these stories in of for solidarity during COVID is that there are old forms, old community networks, these latent networks that get operationalized in certain ways. And then there are new forms, right? So I'm thinking in particular of one story from the Nilgiris, where one of our partners who has a private LLC, limited an LLC, does a lot of sort of value added fair trade kind of production and sale, had to shut down their main commercial outlets, but then redirected their energy and their people power and everything into creating a whole group of mobile sort of food trucks to take things out to people. So their whole sense of community and who they were working for changed. So where in the prior time they were completely connected, they're owned completely by the Adivasi community, now they were feeding people all over the region. So yeah, multiple answers. I don't know if that helps.
Do we have any other questions from the audience? Well, it's been a real pleasure meeting with you each Friday this semester and having a kind of shared community space. I wish you all the very best in the end of the semester and the final throes of turning in your papers and your exams, to a well-earned break at the end of the year. And we'll see you next year.
Thank you, Linda. Thank you for this.
All right, if you can all unmute and say thanks to Nima and Rewa and Alekia and Anna for their presentation today.
Thank you.
Nobody wants to
Thank
do
you.
that.
Thank
Thank you. Thank you
Thank
for
you, guys.
wonderful
Thanks.
presentation.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.